Safron Rossi, welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Thank you, Josh, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm been very much looking forward to this conversation with you. Um, I guess before we jump in, I am curious from your perspective. How do you, I don't know, how do you explain what it is that you do? Because it seems like you do a handful of different things, writing and
hmm
editing, and but how do you sum up what it is you do? And I guess the field in which you do it.
Right. Well, so I'm a professor of mythology in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies Master's PhD program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And that sort of sums it up, which is that I'm a scholar, researcher, writer on the mythic imagination and the way that is understood as central in terms of Jungian and archetypal psychology. So I teach, I write, um, mentor students, and I am also a consulting archetypal astrologer. So that's the second sort of side of my work and my passion. So yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. This whole world of archetypes and myth, it's for me it's kind of a blending of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. You kind of
Mhm.
bring these two people together and that their writings and the kind of their way of explaining things. To me that it just helps me it's like a model that
Mhm.
helps me to really understand the world and the way that people work. And I'm sure it's not whatever version of it exists in my head is not perfect, but it's been extremely helpful for me, especially since I guess I'm something of the seeker
Mhm.
archetype where I'm so curious and always want to know. Um, and which also makes me curious about you and why, what is it in life that drew you towards this focus around story and myth and and psychology or the
Right.
psyche?
Right.
I'm curious, when did that all start for you?
Yeah. Well, I figured you were going to ask me that. And I think where it all began was as a kid, just having an incredible passion for Arthurian legends. I was mad for them, and I couldn't, and myth and fairy tales, but it was particularly Arthurian legends that I really um, became deeply enamored by. And that was something that I held on to as a kid and getting through high school. And then when I went to college, I went to Hampshire College, which is a very liberal arts school um, in Massachusetts. And I was able to continue my deep interests in Arthuriana through like the way I was putting together my portfolio. Like that's what you do at Hampshire. You have an interest, and so you just start taking classes that sort of circumambulate that and deepen your knowledge of it. And the what I knew really deeply, like in an embodied way, not so much I didn't understand it in an intellectual way, but in an embodied way, was that and this was very, very strong once I was in college. It was that myths meant something. And I don't mean that in like the historical sense, which of course is important, cultural developments of different civilizations and traditions and the development of religious symbolism, like all of that is and obviously that's some of the most mainstream ways in which myth is looked at historically, religious studies, culturally. But that wasn't what I was really intuiting and feeling, that somehow these ancient stories, these stories that didn't make any rational sense, that we know are not true, quote unquote, had the deepest significance. but I didn't know what that was. I mean, I'm 18, 19, 20 years old. I mean, what do I know? Um, so I didn't know what that was, and yet I felt it. And so I kind of just kept studying in more of the sort of, mainstream way in which we study these myths and stories. And then I found, when I finished college, I found, and it was in a way circling back to my early family, just what was in the sphere, but Joseph Campbell. And I found The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and simultaneously to that, found Pacifica Graduate Institute, which has a mythological studies program. On the internet. This is the year 2000, 2001. So the internet is just kind of, starting, and you can find places you've never heard of by doing a search online. And in the description of the myth program at Pacifica, they basically said what it was that I was feeling, but didn't have any language for, which was that from the depth psychological perspective, drawing on the work of C.G. Jung, James Hillman, and Joseph Campbell, myths are living stories that relate to the deepest essence of what it is to be human, and that their significance can be recognized in that kind of almost like collapsing between time and space, and recognizing that these stories live within us, even though we are oh so modern, oh so enlightened. So yeah, so that's basic. So it wasn't until I started in graduate school that I was introduced to depth psychology and all of that. But I had all of the exposure to the mythic imagination, if you will, leading up to it. So, yeah, but what about you?
What about me in regards to
Yeah,
myth
like how
and
did you come to like where does myth begin in your life?
yeah, I think that I just have always naturally been some kind of a storyteller, so I could always
Mm.
see, similar to you, I could always see that there was something deeper when it came to stories, or myths. And but the truth is that I grew up in a very religious context. I was raised LDS or Mormon, and so when
Mhm.
the myths
Yeah.
that I was raised on were very concrete. They were very, what Joseph Campbell would say was we literalized our myths, and so
Mhm.
everything was there wasn't a lot of depth to it. You just took it at face value, and so I lived in that world for a long time, and there was just sort of a I guess you could say there was kind of like a lack of a lack of sustenance there, or like substance, and so it felt like um it felt like maybe being thirsty, but not, and the thing that you think should give you that relief is there,
Mhm.
but it's not providing that satiation to your thirst. And so at some point in my early 30s, I stepped away from the religion of my birth and of my youth, and then I would say the way that I tell people, and I've talked about this several times in my podcast, but the way that I think about it, or the way that I experienced it, was kind of a Nietzschean descent into nihilism, where the religion that was the framework for my understanding of reality had collapsed, and then I was left to think, what's the purpose of anything? Because when you have such a religious understanding of the world, everything is supported by that religious belief. And so when I lost faith in my religious institution, I lost faith in almost all institutions,
Mm.
and that's that descent into nihilism, where you're like, well, you can't trust any of the stories anymore. You can't trust any of the groups. And so for me, it started I think I just started to kind of slowly rebuild kind of my understanding of what reality is and what my purpose here is. And it started with an understanding of just physical sciences, biology, evolution, things I had never really looked into before. And eventually I got around to the question of psyche and psychology. And once I started reading, actually a somebody in my family had just randomly come into possession of a couple of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell books, and so I read them. And then once I started reading them, I thought, oh, this is just, it was so eye opening. And for reading Joseph Campbell, I came to see history in a completely different way, as like
Mm-hmm.
this representation of cultural evolution. And then reading Carl Jung, I was able to see the dynamics of, myself and individual psyche. And then also, what was fascinating was I could extrapolate that to different layers of society or groups, and the kind of the functioning of the situation was the same. And yeah, so once I started reading, these types of scholars or authors, I just became enamored with it, and it just became fascinating. And the thing about reading both Jung and Campbell for me is that, um, while it is intellectually stimulating, there is also a feeling that I get
Mm.
that's that's very like enlivening. It's very enlarging, and
Yeah.
I really enjoy that.
Yeah, Campbell's writing style in particular has this I almost there's something of like what's the right word? Like he has this energy in his writing where you feel like you're lifted up like toward whatever it is that he's talking about. It's very enchanting in a way and encompassing. And I think it's for me, my experience reading Jung is different in that with Jung, I feel like I get dropped down deeper into experience because of the way he's able to give language to things which are so difficult to formulate words for or concepts for. So for me, they sort of pull in two different directions, like and on a feeling level. Um, yeah, Campbell kinda goes up.
I could see that, yeah, because
Yeah.
Campbell is all about find your bliss and, reach consciousness through your creative adventures or whatever. And
Yeah.
Jung is a little bit more like, let's go into the depths and look at the scary things.
Well, but one interesting thing, I don't know if you've come across this in your conversations or in your reading, but, yes, Campbell said, "Follow your bliss," but what often is not known is that he had an addendum to that, which is that the path to the bliss means many blisters. That that it's not just a kind of, transcendent, just find what you're passionate about and it's all just going to be kind of, roses and unicorns, but that it's the connection to that sense of calling or that passion that helps us endure the blisters and the difficulties and the closed doors and the hard work that inevitably form the path by which we're, fulfilling and being in relationship to that thing that we long for so much. So I always say that when someone says follow your bliss, because I feel sometimes that pop culture has kind of denuded it of his fuller um understanding of what it takes to be in touch with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Yeah,
I think that the same is true of many of Jung's ideas as well.
right.
They get like simplified or kind of dumbed down to kind of fit a very simple, like you're saying, pop culture
Mm,
narrative. I see that all the time when people talk about things like introversion and extroversion, when people talk about
mm,
synchronicities, they talk
mm,
about it in a way that's completely off the path of what Jung, I think what
mm,
Jung meant when he brought up those issues.
right.
Um, but what's really interesting to me about, from my experience of having a religion that was given to me, and then walking away from that, and then having to decide, okay, if I'm not going to be a nihilist, then I've got to come up with something. You've got to kind of build this back together,
Mm,
and put it together. And I think that the combination of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, it has helped me almost kind of discover or create my own version of a a framework that's worth pursuing, like a life lived that's worth pursuing. Jung's idea of individuation, and you know, and not in like the simplest, do selfish or be an individual type framework, but in the same sense that you're talking about Joseph Campbell and how bliss requires blisters. I think that individuation is the same way, and in a sense it's kind of they almost pair up very well as far as where we're trying to get as far as individuals, or as unique psyches.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very difficult road to walk, but it's one worth walking. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, if I can just, I really appreciate what you're saying. And where can we see that in the mythic imagination? So, for example, thinking about the Arthurian knights and the quest for the grail. So this quest arrives, this grail has to be found because the land is sick and the king is sick, and there are these problems that have to be resolved. So all these different knights know that they have to find the grail. But what's the way? They're not given the path. And in fact, in many of the older versions of the Grail story, like the Wolfram von Eschenbach, which is the German writer, who's the beautiful, the powerful, beautiful version of the Parzival myth. It's described that the knights all had to enter the woods at the point where it was darkest for them on the path. So it's not the same path. It's not even the same potentially woods that they're entering. Each one has to find their own path. And I think that that is really an image for what individuation is, which is the discovery of one's truly unique self, that at the same time in that process of discovering that, it actually means a huge broadening and widening of even how we define ourselves, because it is a process of psychological wholeness. But that's quite distinct from individualism, which is, I think, is what you were saying, that and particularly in our Western American culture, society, there's such a those are two very distinct things. Having this sense of like the credo of being an individual and what we think comes with that, versus the often very difficult work of being in relationship to the larger person that you are, which, I can hear just in your own story. I imagine, leaving a, um, the background, I mean, these things that you knew, these things that on one hand offered a sense of safety and knowledge, but at the same time, as you were saying, like there's no milk in the cup. There's there's something is missing, and that's a profoundly, well, people have these experiences and these are painful. I mean, what Jung might describe it, or Campbell would describe it, is that we fall out of the myth, and that is awful and necessary. But damn, it's awful when we're no longer held, right, in a paradigm that we recognize and feel connected to. But that would be
Absolutely.
part of individuation, the falling out of a myth, in
Yeah.
order to then, from the soil of your own being, discover what's truly yours.
Yeah,
Or yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that's what Carl Jung can give you, kind of with that individuation myth, or that individuation path, is your go finding that darkest spot in your own forest and go pursue that.
Mm,
And when I read something like The Masks of God from Joseph Campbell, I'm able to see how, giving up your myth so that you can create a new, like your own individual one. That's not just something that we do as individuals, but that's something that groups of people have been doing for forever, over and over, where there's a myth that is adopted. And I love the way Joseph Campbell actually puts it, where he kind of, he has so many different ways of describing myth. But one of them is really simply that the purpose of myth is to help move us towards greater consciousness, greater
Mm-hmm.
awareness. And as you go through these different phases of the myth, maybe it's not linear, but maybe we have gradually moved um, towards a more conscious state. You know, where there is something about the Western world and our monotheistic roots that allow us as people who live today to even consider being individuals, or to, to want to pursue something like individuation. Um, it's in a sense, it's like the myth. Joseph Campbell just, I guess he helps me see how we got here, and then Carl Jung kind of helps me see a little bit of where we're going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would, I think the an important thing is that these myths that civilizations, cultures express and cultivate and participate in and believe, that that's actually an arising, like those stories and those and the gods and the figures, those are arising out of the depths of the collective unconscious, that these different archetypal patterns, which we can talk about as values or we can talk about as gods, sort of the spiritual image of an archetypal pattern is a god, a divinity, that they constellate and that they arise, and people and groups are finding stories for them. Where do they come from? Well, I don't know. They come from dreams, and they come out of the imagination from poets and dancers and singers. And it's almost like myth making is a response to what is constellating. And then just as that in a way emerges, so too do certain archetypal figure patterns and figures end up losing energy and going dormant. And that would be like the falling away of a particular religion, that it just sort of peters out, and then something else arises because it gathers all this psychic energy around it. So I don't think it's a conscious thing that people do, but it's that humans, through the history of humanity, are responding to and participating in the creative making and expression of these archetypal realities, or experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said that they arise out of the collective. I'm curious, how far, like how deep do you think they actually go? Do you think that they're in some way, these story arcs and these archetypes are encoded in our DNA? Is it that deep?
I think that, I mean, that would accord with the way Jung talks about the archetypal patterns of the psyche, that the collective unconscious, he calls the, what is it, like 6 million-year-old man. Like the collective unconscious is the repository of all of humanity, every single person. I don't know how, but in some way, our shared, combined, lived experiences somehow are the food that feeds the collective unconscious. And and those archetypal patterns, going back to Jung's theory, are expressed along a pole. On one side of the pole is the instinctual. So that's the body, that's our animal nature, flight and fight and survival and procreation. And so talk about DNA, right? Then in the sense of our biological embodied life, the instinctual basis of life. So that's one end of the spectrum of archetypes. And then the other is what we would call the spiritual, which would be the images that religion gives us and we see in myths, we see in culture, which are the archetypal energies expressed through philosophies and concepts and divinities. So that's the spectrum on which these um, patterns of nature. That's the way I like to think about archetypes, because I think it can get a bit heady when we're talking about these patterns, and it is in many ways. But if we bring it really down, what are archetypes but the patterns of nature, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's inherent to our existence. I think it's something that we're born with. There's this quote from Rumi that sums it up really simply for me, where he says, "You are not a drop of water in the ocean, but you are the ocean in a drop of water."
Mm.
And the way I think about that, when I say that, sometimes I'll say that to my wife, and she'll shake her head and be like, "I have no idea what that means." But what it means to me is very simply that if all of these things are encoded in us all the way down at the level of the DNA, or they emerge in some way through us, or as you're saying, they are the patterns of nature, then it's something that is so deeply ingrained in us. And the question is, well, why? Why have these patterns? And I think what you're saying, it's the patterns of nature. So almost all mammals are going to have some of these patterns. And if you go back further, there's going to be, birds and reptiles that have similar patterns encoded into them. But the interesting thing about being a human is that we have such um, advanced skills of observation and kind of, mental analysis. And there's this fascinating conundrum that humans have where we have to we because of our intelligence, we have to interact with the world in a different way. Our adaptation, our survival mechanism was our intelligence, which which may sound, for some people it just seems so straightforward that they're having an experience at all. But for me it seems like we are if we as individual psyches or as a collective are going to make sense of our environment, of the reality that we live in, there must be some process by which our minds or our bodies go about making that sense. And I think that it's pretty obvious from way back when that symbols appeared, and that they, even animals understand symbols. They navigate the world through symbols, and eventually we paired those symbols with words, and those words became stories. And it seems like it's inevitable that we use stories and symbols and archetypes to interpret the world, interpret our experience.
Yeah, or make meaning of our experience, be able to understand it in a fuller way. I mean, you know, Campbell Campbell said that myth serves four functions, and so he broke it down in a really helpful way. And um, so the four functions, as he saw it in a very general way, was that it has a cosmological function. These are myths that help us understand our small uh, tribe or culture in relationship to these cosmological powers like night and day and rain. These uh, amazing things that just happen, and we are, in relationship to. That there's a mystical dimension, a mystical function to myth, which is that it helps us humans understand something of our relationship to the divinities, to the great mystery of how all of this is, and what is it, what is my responsibility to, the gods, and what is but the mystery of it, and not in us, and it's how am I embedded in it in a meaningful way, or how are my people embedded in it in a meaningful way. And then there's the sociological, which is much more about, I mean, I always use the example of like the 10 commandments. Like, how do we get along as people living in a culture together in a civilization? What are the rules,
Yeah,
right?
what are our values or our morals, and
Our
how, you
shared
know, what do
values.
we, yeah, what do we agree upon? Yeah.
That's right. And then the fourth function would be um, the psychological, which most directly involving the individual, which is how, the way that certain myths and stories aren't speaking about the creation of the world, and they're not speaking about civilization and morals and ethics, but they're speaking about the value of the individual life and helping the individual move through those thresholds and crises, developmental periods and processes that belong to what it is to be an embodied, feeling human person. And so for Campbell, we can look at different myths in a particular from a particular tradition and link it and see the way in which it's serving one or maybe multiple in certain cases of these functions. And ultimately, then these myths, these these stories of deep meaning and significance help us be in relationship to each other and nature and the divine, and um, give us orienting principles by which we can move and navigate and re-story, what it is that we're experiencing and what it is that we're longing for. I think that's the other thing. Myth also speaks to the things we long for. Profound, I mean, what are, myths, love stories? They're giving language and image to the deep longing we have to feel love, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
courage, or power, or change, transformation. Myths of transformation have so much to do with our inherent need for experiences of deep revolutionary change at some point. Again, individually, collectively. I mean, so yeah, I think what we long for is as much important to me in terms of thinking about myths as it is also about meaning making. And then, sorry, the last thing, it feels like a part of this. We could also say that part of what in-depth psychology is considered healing is the helping of someone to find a more appropriate story for their life, or stories that give a meaningful and richer and fuller and deeper sense of significance for who they are and what they've been through. And myths do that, fairy tales do that, great literature, which would be like modern myths, do that. They help us recognize what it is that we've gone through and have a much richer imagination for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I could just sit here and let you keep going, because it's like, so it's moving. There's like so much power to it, because
Yeah,
it is, yeah, it's one thing to analyze it, but it's another thing to actually feel it. And the way that you talk about the four methods, or the four approaches,
functions. Yeah,
yeah, the four functions of myth, um that's really powerful for me too, because I grew up in such in a state where everything was so literalized. And so
mm,
it was used, the myth was used to help us understand everything. But what was missing, I think, was that other form that you were discussing, or that other function, around the psychological, around the
mm,
individual. And that right there, the function of myth, and then pairing that with Carl Jung's kind of model of the psyche, those two things become extremely powerful tools,
right.
because once you see every story as a representation of yourself, that's like the first step. You go, okay, I'm going to watch this movie and I'm going to think about this movie as if it's entirely about me. And or I'm going to I have this dream, and this dream is so crazy, and I'm telling my friend about it, and there's so many crazy characters and events. Um, but at some point, if for you to really get some value out of that dream, you've got to be able to look at it as if that dream is about you. And so what Jung does with his model of the psyche, with the various the self and the ego and the shadow and the persona and the anima, what that helps me do then is when I have a dream or I watch a movie, I can identify the characters
Mhm.
as various archetypes, and then you can see kind of the processes that they're going through and how they interact. And one of the one of the beautiful things about art, about story, about movies, paintings, music, whatever it is when the artist captures what the real feeling is between the
Mhm.
archetypes, or what the real story is, and in such a way that your own psyche recognizes it, and there's this
Right.
feeling of connection. And
Yes.
it's beautiful and it's powerful.
Yeah.
And
And I would say, I think part of what's so powerful about that experience is because somehow the what the artist, the filmmaker, the actor, I mean, it's always really kind of an amazing synergy of things that make for incredible art, but even painting, music, um, the what has been brought forward is archetypal in the sense that it's all of a sudden deepened our sense of the experience rather than um, made it narrower or smaller or more confined. And that's the difference between an archetype and a stereotype. Stereotypes flatten, and archetypal figures, archetypal scenes and situations qualitatively always give us a sense of something's been deepened. Yeah, we might recognize ourselves. And so there's a knowing, but there's also a sense of, oh, wow, there's more than even I know. But that's it. But it's like a little light has been shone on it all of a sudden into the depths that continue and the mystery of it. And so I feel like that, yeah, that those moments, as you're saying, in great art, we both recognize ourselves and somehow experience a deepening of something that's beyond us, and yet we participate in some way. And that's really
yeah,
powerful.
yeah, it's almost like a direct encounter with the mystery,
Yeah,
like the mysterious. And so
that's
then
right.
there's this numinous effect of enlarging, where you go, oh, it's that realization that there's so much more than you could ever fully wrap your head around.
Right.
It's a yeah. But you said, okay, so earlier you said, before we started recording, you had said something about Joseph Campbell, and how you felt like maybe he was disappearing in society.
Well,
And
no,
I
I was
wanted,
just, I always have a question mark, or I wonder, and where's this coming from? It's coming from, obviously, a kind of generational move. I'm in my late 40s, and I now have students that are in their 20s and 30s. And when I mention Joseph Campbell and I get a kind of blank, quizzical look, I'm often floored. And so, and I think that's because growing up, I was growing up at a time when, Campbell, The Power of Myth was aired, was it 1989, I think, because it aired after he died. He, so I grew up in that milieu where everyone knew about Campbell and Bill Moyers and The Power of Myth and all of that. And that isn't necessarily the case anymore. And so I wonder, how and where um, people are connected to Campbell's work, and I think it's really important. Um, and and you know, I think one of the things that I wonder about too is and I don't think it's controversial to say this, but we have been living through a period where it seems that differences are what people really pay a lot of attention to. How are we different as a culture, as a group, as a peoples that belong to the larger roiling definition of what it is to be an American, even in academia, whatever. It's just that there's been so much emphasis on what separates and differentiates us. And the thing about Campbell is that his work is all about what connects us, where we are alike, not in an effort to wash away cultural, religious differences and particularities. Those are, of course, important, all of our multiplicity. But as humans, where are we alike? What do we share? And so I wonder if, yeah, like I, it's that I think is important, and I just wonder where that sits, in terms of the kind of cultural conversation, let's say that we've been that happens. So those are
Yeah.
my thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer for you. I know that I'm very interested in Joseph Campbell, and some of the people that
Yeah,
I hang out with are.
right,
Um,
right.
but one thing I think I definitely notice is that I hear the name Carl Jung more often than I did before. And it
Uh-huh.
may be just because I'm more familiar with him. I've read a bunch of his books, and I'm like a little bit of a Jungian nut myself, just because I find it so fascinating. Um,
So maybe there's a new term for that, Jung nut, wing nut, Jung nut. No, I'm
yeah,
kidding. Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, a Jung nut. Um, yeah, I try to. It's interesting because coming from the world I come from, um, I could easily see how somebody could look at Jung and begin to think of them as some kind of think of him as some kind of a religious leader or a new kind of prophet, especially now that the Red Book is available.
Hmm.
And it reads so similar to, some forms of scripture and, ancient story or whatever. So I
Right.
could see how that could take place, but at the same time, uh, obviously that's like the last thing Carl Jung would ever want. But I can see there's this thing happening where because of science, because of technology, because of social media, the myths are collapsing all around. People are losing faith in institutions. The Overton window is expanding, and there is this where before there was kind of this tension between science and spirituality, or rationality and religion. I think what people like Carl Jung are providing, and maybe even people like Joseph Campbell, because he's certainly done this for me, they're creating this bridge where it's like, yeah, we're supposed to, um we are spiritual beings, we are myth-centered beings, but we can still be rational, we can still make sense. um
Oh, yeah.
you know
Yeah,
I think that's what I
absolutely.
see.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I think one of Campbell's sparring partners was not rationality or history or science, but rather the taking of something meant to be understood symbolically and historicizing or literalizing it. That was his issue, not with like history itself or um you know I mean, or space exploration and being able to see, down to the scientific basis of how matter and space is made. But to think, but to think that because we understand so much about the nature of reality, that means that myths aren't important anymore. That's the mistake, he would say. Myths don't have to be we don't have to be looking at those stories as ways of um, pseudoscience explaining the physical nature of things. There's this whole other level that those stories are really getting at, and to reject them without an understanding, a proper understanding of the psychological, metaphorical dimension. That, that's the joust he's having, so
Yeah.
to speak. The
Yeah,
enemy
absolutely.
on the other
Yeah.
side. Yeah.
Yeah, he does this great job of pointing out, the story arcs in the myth, and he does a great job of pointing out maybe what the myths have borrowed from other myths that came
Mhm.
before them, um
Sure.
but at the same time he does a good job of not letting that take away from the importance of the myth or the power of the myth. And there's like an example there of how you can apply, rather than reject religion and its stories outright, you can just look at it from a different perspective, particularly since if you imagine all of myth as an ongoing evolution, it's a living story, it's changing constantly. You see it even in the way that Disney has changed over the years. You see the stories evolving in real time. And and we're all a part of that, like especially since we're in this age where the myths are losing their grasp. And so I think Joseph Campbell pointing out that the myths changing is a good thing, and that you shouldn't, that there are different ways of looking at myths or different functions of myths. And then you pair that with something like the Red Book,
Mhm.
where Carl Jung comes along and he says you don't have to literalize Christianity, but you can still apply the myth to yourself, and it becomes the most powerful thing you can do in this time, because we are all a product of our time and age, which is the
Well,
evolution of those
partly.
myths moving forward.
We're
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
we're partly related to the spirit of the times, but we're also related to the spirit of the depths, and that would be the archetypal, right? The transpersonal, the ahistorical. That's why the myths can work, because they connect us to what is timeless and eternal and deep, deep within.
Yeah,
Yeah.
truths that have always been, but have maybe, stories that may have never actually literally happened, but have always been true.
That's right. I mean, my favorite definition of myth is from a kindergartner. So, shout out to the genius of 6-year-olds. And it's myths are stories that are not true on the outside, but they're true on the inside.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Right? I
Yeah.
mean, who needs a
And
PhD in mythology?
that's what Joseph Campbell was kind of getting at, that when there was an interview, and it might have been the one with Bill Moyers, where he said that a lot of times people treat myth, that they think the word myth means it's a lie,
Yeah,
and
falsehood.
yeah,
Yeah.
falsehood, and that's just not the case. You just have to think about it a little bit deeper and get into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I do want to ask you about your own book. You've got a book called Core Goddess.
Yeah, the core. Yeah, core.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So sorry, did I say the name wrong? Is it the
Yeah,
Core A?
so you actually pronounce the E, so it's core.
Oh, I see. Okay,
Uh-huh.
see,
Yeah.
those are all my fubs, is
Oh, that's
pronunciation.
okay. That's all right. Yeah, no worries.
Okay, so the Core A Goddess.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. I,
So, yeah, go on.
well, yeah, I was just curious about what the Core Goddess means to you, but also why is that an important thing for you to kind of bring into the collective at this time?
Well, so the very briefly, core is the ancient Greek word for virgin or maiden. And so w- this is an archetypal figure that we see across many different mythologies. And in the tradition of depth psychology, there hasn't there hasn't been what I felt was not enough attention given to this archetypal figure and where it shows up both in the depth psychological literature, and then exploring how does this figure move in life, what are the principles or the values that belong to this figure. And so my book is really an exploration from those two sides. And the thing about the core that is so significant, depth psychologically speaking, is that for Jung, even though this wasn't something that he developed, but some of the first generation female analysts picked up here and there, in which I tried to draw together and, a sort of a kind of review of the history of this figure in the field, is that Jung thought he understood the core to actually be a self figure for women, in contradistinction to the wise old man, or like a Philemon figure being a self figure for men. And, if the self, capital S self, as we would say, really personifies the inner God, that's a very significant figure to be able to have as many possible images for and understandings in order for people to be able to follow their own trail through the dark woods, so to speak. And so that was part of my sort of sense about pursuing this topic, which is, well, who is the core? What are some of the mythic figures that personify this archetypal pattern? What are the values that belong to this archetypal pattern? How do those show up in life? And some of the themes. So where does that show up in life? It's around the themes of sovereignty. If we think about virgin, not in a literal biological sense, but as a metaphor, to be virgin means to be unto oneself, right? To belong to oneself. That's
Yeah, because
profound.
in a sense, you haven't been given to somebody else, or
That's right.
nobody's
Or you
taken
haven't,
from you. Yeah,
yeah, you haven't allowed
you're,
someone in.
yeah,
You are whole. And it can even be translated to mean undivided. Uh, Now, that, what is it to have a connection for all people, regardless of their biological gender orientation, the matter of being in touch with some inviolable, essential core of self is profoundly important in terms of our psychological health and wholeness. And so so that the book is exploring that through this particular archetypal figure. So it's in
yeah.
service
Interesting.
to psychology, it's in service to mythology, and sort of drawing this figure out of the shadows, if you will. Um, yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, if I was to maybe state it back to you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it it seems that in our world we have a lot of myths for that where the central figure is a man, and it happens all the time in fairy tales and movies and whatever. And there's this, like, you mentioned the wise old man or the Philemon character. There's like this image that is available for men to pursue as like an ideal image. And are you saying that the Korah then is the same idea for, it's this ideal image for a woman to pursue in a similar kind of
Right.
individuation path?
Right. In terms of individuation. So it's not about becoming the core, but it's about having a relationship. It's because it really is an archetypal figure. And so it's transpersonal. We're talking about, something that isn't human. It extends beyond it. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a core point, Josh, and that's really important to say, which is that in the absence of having the images by which we can sort of point the North Star of our inner development, we are lacking that kind of direction. And this has been, I think, one of the really significant contributions of goddess studies and goddess scholarship, again, all across sort of the different disciplines in which that might emerge, cultural anthropology and religious studies. But it's like being able to retrieve these amazing figures from traditions that are so deep, but of course, which we've lost sight of in our particularly Christian, monotheistic, Western historical worldview, um, we have we have suffered from an absence of more feminine, and I use that in the symbolic sense, feminine figures that help shine a light on all these other archetypal patterns and principles and values. And so to retrieve those, it's like it expands our language, so to speak, and our imagining, and helps us connect to dimensions of our deeper nature that we might not even have been able to recognize in the absence of having something like Artemis or Athena or Inanna to help us begin to, see. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Especially in, like you said, in this monotheistic world where all the goddesses you mentioned are like goddesses of the past,
Yeah.
and
Well, who do
they
we
don't
have
come
in
up in our stories.
Christianity?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We have
we do have
Mary.
the Virgin Mary,
And
yeah.
she's thank Mary for Mary. But, that's a very particular set of archetypal principles that she personifies. And there's a lot other that we don't see
Yeah,
if she's
absolutely.
who we have alone.
This
Yeah,
is really interesting because this reminds me of a quote from Joseph Campbell's Goddess. And I don't think we mentioned this on the recording yet, but you are the editor of this book, which
that's right.
I found it to be very exciting. So in the introduction, there's this quote where it says, "And to repeat, there are no models in our mythology for an individual woman's quest, nor is there any model for the male in marriage to an individuated female. We are in this thing together and have to work it out together, not with passion, which is always archetypal,
Mm,
but with compassion and patient fostering of each other's growth." And I
mm.
guess that's what he's pointing out, is that we haven't had that model for women in this individuation path. And what you're proposing here is that the Kora goddess
Is part of
is
it.
that is part of that model. Yeah. I
That's
think that's
right.
fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And yeah, this image of a figure who is sovereign. She is her own authority. She is an individual. She is connected and expresses the purest dimension of her essence. She has a profound sense of boundaries. That these are, very significant um, dimensions that would belong to the a sense of a woman's sense of wholeness, and the many different parts of her own interior being. Yeah.
Yeah. And from a, I guess from a female perspective, there is also or a feminine perspective, there's also like the crone, which is like an older version of an archetype.
Well, it's the old woman. That's right, the wise old woman. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious, uh, the relationship you see between the two archetypes, or why the pursuit of one, or just the focus on one may be more, I don't know, useful or more impactful than the focus on the other.
No, not at all. I mean, again, what does depth psychology put forward? But that we have our inner world is a roiling multiplicity of figures, and so we need all of them. Um, but and a relationship to all of them. But I think that, I mean, in terms of the sort of thesis that I put forward in the book, I was drawing on a point that a very important Jungian analyst named Jane Hollister Wheelwright, who actually had been in analysis with Jung, she had given this unpublished lecture back in the 80s on the power of the maiden. And she puts forward that what she was beginning to see in her work with her analyses was that there was this mysterious youthful maiden figure that was appearing in their dreams, and that it seemed to be the self, like there's the figure in which one felt the greatest sort of numinous energy and value. Um, and so she felt that we were seeing, as you and I talked about earlier, that at some point certain archetypes constellate and certain archetypes kind of, um, go back into the earth of the psyche, so to speak. But the core has been constellating in the psyches of women. And I think we can see that in the 60s and 70s and 80s in the second wave feminism and equality and all of these more socio political, socio-cultural movements and values and being articulated. What is the archetypal core that's being expressed there? A sense of agency and autonomy and equal value. Well, in the mythopoetic language of the archetypes, that's the ground of the core, the virgin, that I am as I am and can be in relationship, but that my value and beingness is fully sovereign and true to itself. So, in that sense, I think the core is profoundly significant in our day and age because of this question of being in touch with our beingness and our essential truth of who we are as an individual. Um, and I think that's the case for men as much as it is for women, right? But obviously, this figure is going to appear and maybe carry a certain psychic gravity for women, slightly different for men. Although the Kore can be a very powerful anima figure for men, of course.
Yeah, that's actually
Yeah.
that's one thing I was going to ask you about as well, is the relationship then to the anima or
Yeah.
animus. So with the way Jung, at least the way I remember Jung talking about it, is that the anima for a man is typically a young woman or a maiden, like you're saying, the Cora, and then the animus figure for women is often an older man or an older masculine figure.
I don't think it's necessarily older or young. And in fact, animus figures tend to come in multiples. And so it can be a grouping. But yeah, his
Ooh.
whole notion of anima animus was contrasexual. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Hmm.
then if the Cora kind of represents something similar to the self or that true kind of center, then the thing perhaps acting on it is then this animus figure. And
How do you mean? How is
is that how
animus?
you see it?
Mean animus acting on the self?
Well, yeah, so take like a from a masculine perspective, you may have like a fairy tale and the hero is going to be a masculine figure and his job is to go rescue the maiden or the
Mhm.
Cora. And then so just in that same sense, then the the anima then is like this call to the quest, or like, here is the quest, go save this anima figure. But and then to flip it around, so if the self is, from a female perspective, the self is this Cora figure or goddess, then how does the animus, how does
Well,
he
he's the
call her into
connector.
action?
Well, he's the bridge, to use a more sort of Jungian term, that he is somehow related to bridging the ego consciousness to this figure, and that would come through certain things like, what does the animus do? It functions to help differentiate. So as we differentiate our sense of what we value or what's mine and what's not mine, that connects us to that core, that the core self. Um, so it's perhaps we could think of it as learning how to stand on on one's own, and how the animus might be in service to that. Yeah. So that those are some of the ways maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting idea, and I think it is empowered. Like they're especially, I have a daughter, and so I look at my daughter and I think like, what is the image that she, what is the highest possible image that she can choose to pursue? What is her greatest potential? And um, it puts me in forever in search of these type of characters,
Mm,
these figures that come out of ancient myth, or that come out of new stories and new novels, or even, for a child, for my daughter, for in like children's books, and these female characters that do help her see that she can turn inward, and that she can have that trust in self, that intuition, that individuation process for her own.
mhm. That's right. Yeah, I think that that's lovely. I hope you give her the core.
Do you think it's up to me to give it to her?
Get that book? Absolutely. Why not? It,
The book. I thought you meant the actual
no,
archetypal
no, no,
image,
no.
like
The
to
book,
instill it inside
the
of
book.
her.
Like maybe when she turns
Mm,
13 or something. But
yeah, I will. Yeah,
I
I do
mean,
discuss a lot of that with her.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Saffron, I've really appreciated you taking this time to speak with me. I think this is, I mean, I could talk to you about this kind of stuff for hours. So, but I won't do that to you. But I really do appreciate you taking the time and discussing these things with me. If there's somebody who wants to find you and your work, your writing, where would they go to find you?
Yeah, I have a website. I mean, I can be found just by Googling me, but the title of my website is The Archetypal Eye. And I'm also on Substack. So yeah, those are the two main places.
Okay, awesome. And I'll share
Yeah.
those. I'll share those links
Okay.
in the show notes as well. Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, thanks again, Saffron. I really
Thanks,
appreciate it,
Josh.
and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Sounds good. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks.